It's Julian Assange and WikiLeaks that have returned honor to journalism. Julian is a truth teller, and that's what has upset those who continue what Goebbels called the big lie.
Anton Karas of The Third Man, and that was John Pilger at the very top, and I'll talk about that in a second. I'm Randy Credico, and this is Randy Credico live on the fly on 99.5 FM, WBAI, WBAI.org. Also, Assange Countdown to Freedom. I mentioned John Pilger because John Pilger, when he found out that my guest today was Nils Melzer, who is the special rapporteur on torture at the UN, was going to be on the show. Pilger said to me, he says, Nils Melzer is probably the most important expert witness to Julian Assange's suffering and total innocence of anything except good journalism. Nils Melzer has so many credits. If I were to enumerate them, we would be here for another week. So let me get right into it. Welcome back to the show, Mr. Melzer, Professor Melzer.
Thank you very much, Randy. It's good to be back.
It's great to have you on. Now, you came onto the scene, the Professor Melzer, back in 2019, back in May and June. How did you first get involved? Because you had already been with the UN for 3 years at that point, and you did not get involved. But what triggered your involvement in the Assange case?
I was actually first contacted by Assange's legal team in December 2018. That would be about 2 years ago. Assange was still at the Ecuadorian embassy at the time. I had never really worried about his case, and they contacted me and said that his living conditions had become a form of cruel, inhumane, and degrading treatments, and they wanted my intervention. And I remember distinctly, it was just about exactly 2 years ago, just before Christmas, and I was working on my report for the UN, and I see this message popping up on my screen, like, Julian Assange's lawyers want your protection. And I immediately had this visceral reaction of, no, I'm not going to get involved. I'm not going to get manipulated by this narcissist and rapist and hacker and spy and traitor. And I had all these names popping up in my mind, basically, of how bad a person Assange was. And I basically just refused to get into this case. And out of my sight, out of my mind. And what was really interesting is that I never even asked myself where I got this knowledge from that Assange was a rapist and a hacker and a spy. And so his legal team actually had to contact me again 3 months later in March 2019. And they said they were really worried he was going to be expelled from the embassy soon. And they sent me some pieces of evidence along. And then I kind of remembered 3 months ago, I just had refused to get into this case. What actually had triggered my emotional reaction? And then I realized I had been under the influence of a kind of a public narrative that had been pushed for a decade through the press that described Assange as all of these things, the rapist, the narcissist, the spy, and the hacker. But that actually, I had never even verified that information. And I started to open the evidence in front of me. And as soon as I scratched the surface of the case, I realized that there was nothing to back up this narrative. It had actually been created in order to demonize him and to mobilize the public opinion against him. So everybody would just look at Assange and his, alleged misconduct, but no one would actually look at what he had exposed, which is the elephant in the room, which is the misconduct of the states, where we're talking about war crimes, aggressive war, corruption, and other misconduct. And the effect of creating this narrative of the suspected rapist and hacker and so on, that basically pulled public attention on Assange, and nobody worried about what was really important, which was the conduct of the state.
I see. So you mentioned, you wrote an article on May 20th in 2019. You went to visit him. In Belmore's prison. You wrote an article, and you used the word mobbing in the article. What did you mean by mobbing, and what part did both the government and the media play in this mobbing?
Yeah. Well, to be very, very honest with you, as soon as I started realizing something's wrong in this case, I felt I had to go and visit the man. The case is so politicized, it's not possible to have an objective assessment without actually going to the place, seeing the man. And I took two medical doctors with me, a forensic expert and a psychiatrist, both of them independent from the UN, very experienced, specialized in examining torture victims. And I took them along to make sure that I had an objective assessment. So we examined Julian Assange for 4 hours on the 9th of May, 2019. And I also talked to him bilaterally. And we all three of us independently came to the same conclusion, that he showed all the symptoms that are typical for a victim of psychological torture. And now, psychological torture is not torture light. It really is a way of a form of ill treatment that aims at destroying a person's self-confidence, orientation, sense of individuality, and can lead to nervous breakdowns, heart attacks, and in the end, also a very high suicide risk. It's always the same patterns. You're isolating a person, then you're demonizing them, humiliating them, threatening them, and in the end, the person has no longer a normal frame of reference for a healthy life and basically internally collapses. And the perfidious thing about it is it doesn't leave any physical traces. So that really is what we observed with Assange already in May 2019. And I have to ask myself the question, what is the cause for this, for these symptoms? And now in Assange's case, it was fairly easy to identify because he had been locked up in a room in the Ecuadorian embassy for more than 6 years. And so nothing else could have caused these effects than what he had experienced in that very room. And he was exposed to just a handful of factors, the harassment of the staff at the Ecuadorian embassy, the constant threat of being extradited to the US and tried, in secret at the espionage court in Alexandria, and then put in a supermax under special administrative measures for the rest of his life, which basically means total isolation, and not to have the right to defend himself, in due process, as would be provided by the law.
So the psychological torture, the effects you see, it's very clear. Do you think he will recover in his lifetime from the effects of all of this, from the psychological torture?
What I can see, he's a very resilient person, obviously. I mean, the fact that he's still alive after 10 years of persecution is a miracle. And I'm not saying that, I'm saying that as someone who has visited, literally thousands of detainees and prisoners in war areas, in Secret Service prisons all around the world. So I know what I'm talking about. So, Julian Assange is obviously a very intelligent and resilient person, but he will certainly remain traumatized for the rest of his life. This is very grave, what has been done to him, and I think it deserves to be exposed.
Why in this day and age are fundamental moral issues freedom and justice that Julian's case exemplifies, relegated, to something that doesn't matter anymore?
Well, I think it's an emblematic case that is of utmost importance for the United States, for us in Western Europe, for everybody in the world at large, if you want to defend the values of individual freedom, individual fundamental rights, freedom of speech. Julian Assange, it's not a question whether you like the person. It really is. This is not an issue. He has friends like everybody else has, and I have friends that like me, and I have people that don't like me. That's not the issue here. The question is, did he do anything wrong? And when we see what he did, is that he exposed enormous amount of information that provides evidence for serious misconduct by government officials, not only in the United States, but around the world, and also CEOs of powerful companies. And now, do we as an ordinary citizens have an interest to know that? Well, I believe so, because we're financing this whole thing. We're paying taxes to our government, so they represent us, and they actually protect our interests. And I don't believe, that the interests of the normal American people, just as, the Swiss people or the German people or the people anywhere else in the world, is that their armed forces go out in the world, and if some soldiers commit war crimes, that they should be prosecuted. Obviously, they're criminals just like any other criminal. They don't deserve to be, to get impunity, because we should not identify with soldiers that don't do their job properly. And that's exactly what happened in this case, is that we have, people just like, some of those soldiers in the collateral murder video that, killed without any necessity, wounded people on the ground that should have been protected by the laws of war. And this never came to the public until Julian Assange actually published a leaked video illustrating and demonstrating this war crime. And this is just one example of thousands of documents he published that are very, very important for us to know what the powerful are actually doing with our tax money. And is this wrong? Well, if this is wrong, then investigative journalism is wrong. Then the Pentagon papers were wrong. Then, all these, then exposing the Holocaust is wrong. But I think we have to be very principled here. Exposing war crimes, exposing misconduct is not treason, is not espionage. It is the very purpose of investigative journalism. And investigative journalists that do that are our friends. We absolutely need them for the sanity of our societies.
I totally agree with you. I last spoke to you, as I said, back in January, just prior to the first round of hearings at Belmarsh. What was your impression? What were your thoughts seeing all of this unfold?
Well, what we can see, it's a playbook, right? I mean, Julian Assange has been prosecuted, but I would say persecuted for 10 years. And why do I say persecuted? Because when prosecution is used for political purposes, then it becomes persecution. That's exactly what happened here. It happened in Sweden, where the Swedish prosecuting service intentionally misused a case where women came with some complaints to the police because they wanted to get an HIV test from Julian Assange. That's all they wanted. They didn't want to report any offense. And the police intentionally created a rape allegation out of this, took it out of the hands of the women against their will, and pushed a rape suspect narrative, which they then maintained for 10 years in order to demonize him in the public opinion, without giving him a opportunity to properly defend himself. Now, this is consistent with what happens with Britain. the British proceedings, where you can see that consistently in all stages of all proceedings, his procedural due process rights are being severely violated. And I'm a professor at a British university in Glasgow. I was even proud of the tradition, of the rule of law tradition of the British judiciary, and I couldn't believe with kind of how relaxed the British authorities are about violating Julian Assange's procedural rights systematically and severely, and even don't provide any redress when there are complaints. When we're talking about violations, we're talking about a defendant who's about to be extradited to the most powerful country in the world, who has an army of lawyers, put up against him. He doesn't have access to his lawyers. He doesn't have access to legal documents. He's put in a solitary confinement where he cannot communicate with the outside world, and he cannot prepare his defense. Now, I think we all agree that even the worst criminal deserves a fair trial, but he's not even a criminal. He's a journalist, and he cannot even have, his basic fundamental due process rights protected. And I'll give you an example to compare. Julian Assange is being held exclusively, not to punish him for anything. He's not a convict. He's held exclusively for preventative purposes, so he doesn't run away during the extradition proceedings to the United States. So the only need to keep him safe somewhere is to prevent his escape. Compare it to the case of Augusto Pinochet, the former dictator of Chile. He was in London when the Spanish and the Swiss and the French government asked for his extradition because of crimes that had been committed during his dictatorship. So he was in extradition detention for 1.5 years or so in London, and the British authorities gave him a house arrest in a noble villa where he was visited by Margaret Thatcher and other guests, and he had no limits on receiving visitors. He was able to communicate freely, and that's exactly the type of regime that Julian Assange is entitled to. He's not a convict. He's not being punished for anything, but he's being kept in isolation, not because it's necessary or proportionate or lawful, but because the states want to silence him. That is the aim. This is how they reveal what the real motivation is behind all these proceedings. And that's the same in the US, the UK, Sweden. They're all on the same side because they are all interested to silence WikiLeaks, to silence Assange, not because they're committing any crimes, but because they're exposing the crimes of the government.
He's basically spent 2 years in prison and he hasn't been convicted. And prior to that, 7 years in that embassy. So 9 years he's been imprisoned and he's never committed a crime. And it's preemptive detention. They don't want him out there doing what he does. What really bothers me is that why doesn't the British government at least consider, you have Human Rights Watch, you have Amnesty International, you have Reporters Without Borders, you have these UN panels, your crew at the UN, all speaking out, these heavyweight NGOs, and yet they have totally steadfastly refused to give in at all.
It's for political purposes. I mean, to be absolutely correct, we have to say that Julian Assange spent 6 months actually as a convict, the first 6 months in the British prison in 2019, because he had violated formally the bail conditions of the British judiciary 7 years earlier when he sought asylum in the Ecuadorian embassy. But that too, he was under a bail condition of the British court with regard to the Swedish extradition case, an extradition case where the Swedes just last year had to admit they never had evidence against him, and they actually had to close the entire 9-year investigation for rape allegations because they never had sufficient evidence even to charge him. So he's never been charged. There was never been sufficient evidence for that, but they maintained this narrative for 9 years. And so because Julian Assange obviously was aware of this, and he knew that he was not being extradited to Sweden for a fair proceeding about rape allegations. This was, he feared about Sweden wanting to fast track his extradition to the US because they have a specific provision in their extradition treaty that would allow them to actually temporarily surrender him to the United States without a proper extradition proceeding. Julian Assange knew that, and so he wanted the Swedish to guarantee that he would not be extradited on to the US. He wanted to come to Stockholm to defend himself against these rape allegations. He said, there's no problem, I'm going to come along, but I want you to guarantee that this is not about sending me onwards to the US. And the Swedes always refused to do that. And so he got suspicious. And so you're absolutely right. What we see here is really that states are acting, it's a typical political persecution where states are not acting according to the law, but they're abusing the legal institutions in order to persecute someone that they perceive for political purposes to be an inconvenient dissident.
Professor Meltzer, you have been one of the biggest champions, vocal, eloquent champions of Assange, and it's really been a noble effort. I gotta think that you must be getting some pushback because you're dealing with some very heavy, powerful entities. Do you get pushback at all?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I don't receive any direct threats so far. But the messaging is very clear. I mean, I don't receive a lot of funding. Some of the funding has been withdrawn that states had previously provided to my mandate for the research, so I could do research about violations of the torture prohibition. I can see that that my career options certainly will not benefit from this. But all of this is really not that important, because I think what's important is that when you're in a position like this and you get access to all of this information and you get access to this case and you actually understand what's going on, I think my duty is to inform the public. First, to engage with governments and to call them out and to ask them to change their course and to provide redress. But if they don't, then we have a serious problem.
I wanted to ask you about the COVID threat. You asked for the government of Great Britain to release him because of that. Also, the news is that Trump may pardon him. I think that's apocryphal. But just in a minute and a half, could you summarize what your thoughts are about that and what the implications are if Julian Assange, to free press, the whole concept, if he is indeed extradited and sent to the US, convicted and sent to prison?
Well, clearly, to me, there is no way this extradition trial could result lawfully in an extradition, because, first of all, he's accused of espionage, which is a political offense, and extraditions for political offenses are prohibited. As I said before, I don't expect him to receive a fair trial at the espionage court in Alexandria. I don't expect him to get humane treatment with the sanctions that he's likely to receive. So all of this results in an assessment that there's no way we can extradite him, lawfully to the United States. His current conditions of detention are dire. As I said, he would deserve to be somewhere in house arrest. He has a family, he has 2 small kids. He's a journalist who just wants to do his job and inform the public about the misconduct of governments. It's up to the governments to correct their behavior. It's not solved the problem when you suppress truth, but they really have to correct their the governmental conduct. So all on top of his solitary confinement and his dire health conditions, we have heard a few weeks back that COVID has broken out in the very wing where he's being detained in Belmarsh prison. So now he's under complete isolation 24 hours a day, has no access to his family, and he's apparently freezing because the prison authorities are not even giving out his warm clothing that he would need in his cell. So he has a pre-existing lung condition, respiratory condition, so that puts him in actual life danger. And so I intervened with the government and asked for his immediate release or transfer to a house arrest setting. I also think that, as you just mentioned now, it's a period where President Trump might pardon certain individuals, just like Edward Snowden or Julian Assange. And I can only call on him to do precisely that, because President Trump, I'd like to remind him, has always claimed that he will clean up corruption in the establishment, that he is against the misconduct of governmental powers. And therefore, clearly, Julian Assange is doing precisely that, defending precisely these values. And if President Trump is true to his values, I think the least thing he could do is to end the suffering of Julian Assange, to pardon him. This man has suffered enough for the interests of the public around the world.
Sir Meltzer, thank you for all the work that you have done in support of Julian Assange and for those suffering from abuse, from torture, and other misbehavior by governments around the world. Folks, I'm Randy Credico. This is Randy Credico Live on the Fly here on WBAI 99.5 FM. Also, Assange Countdown to Freedom. See you next week. But we're going to go out with a special version of Bob Pincero from Nabucco by Giuseppe Verdi. Here's to the children of the world. These are the Cambodian and Tibetan Children's Choir. We'll see you next week.